I bet you've heard a little something about convalescent plasma in the last few days. In this episode of Shareable Science Beyond the Blog, we'll dig into the science behind the headlines.
Welcome to Shareable Science. Science you can share.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration recently gave emergency use authorization for convalescent plasma to treat COVID-19. Emergency use authorization means that they believe it may be effective in treating COVID-19, but they don't have the definitive data. So we've got a growing evidence base, but we don't have the data that would normally qualify for full FDA approval. We've talked about convalescent plasma in earlier episodes of Shareable Science Beyond the Blog, but for a quick refresher, that's the liquid part of the blood from patients who have recovered from COVID-19. And the huge beneficial ingredient in the plasma are antibodies from these recovered patients, specifically antibodies that are believed to bind and neutralize the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So the thinking is, if you take convalescent plasma and you give it to a patient who is currently infected, who currently has COVID-19, these antibodies may be beneficial in helping slow the spread of the virus and helping flag and destroy infected cells. We all make antibodies when we get ill, but it takes a while for those antibodies to show up. And if you can jumpstart the process by giving convalescent plasma, you may give patients a leg up on their recovery. So in March, early in the pandemic in the United States, the FDA opened access to an early expanded access program. So they created an expanded access program organized by people at the Mayo Clinic. And the goal of this expanded access program was to make it easier to gain access to convalescent plasma and to make it available to physicians and hospitals around the country. It's been incredibly successful. More than 70,000 individuals have been treated at more than 2,700 hospitals. In June, this group released their first set of observational data saying that convalescent plasma for COVID-19 is safe, that there were no unexpected side effects, nothing that would give people pause. And they also had some early hints that giving it to individuals early in infection might be more beneficial than waiting until later in the course of infection. Now again, this is an observational study. There was not a control arm of this project. So there was nobody in this group that was getting a placebo. That's not the reason why this was set up. But still, there are some important pieces we can gain from looking at the data. All right, before I turn the board around to show you their most recent observations, I just want to caution you, there's a lot of numbers on here. Hang with me, we'll get through this. So this is data from the 12th of August from a preprint, so it hasn't gone through peer review yet, looking at 35,000 patients around the country who received convalescent plasma sometime between the 4th of April and the 4th of July. All right, we're going to look at two things: the timing of when they received the plasma and the amount of antibodies that were present in the plasma that they received. So I want you to focus on a handful of numbers. This is the number of people that were in the two treatment categories: the number of people that received it within the first 3 days of being diagnosed, and the number of people that received it when they were 4 or more days outside their initial diagnosis. So later in treatment, earlier in treatment. This is the percentage of those people who were treated who actually died. So 8.7% of this 15,000 had died within 7 days of treatment. 21.6% of this 15,000 had died within 30 days of treatment. So with that orientation, here are some key things that we would want to notice. There was a smaller mortality. Fewer individuals died when treatment was given within the first 3 days. So early treatment as opposed to late treatment. And that also carried out when you went all the way out and looked at how people were doing 30 days after they had received treatment. If we look down here at the amount of antibody, the first thing you're going to want to notice is that these overall numbers are much smaller. there were a smaller number of cases where there was enough convalescent plasma left after the treatment that they could actually do the antibody testing. So we're looking at a smaller sample size, and that's always really important. And it was broken into 3 groups based on the amount of antibodies that were found: relatively low amounts, medium amounts, and the highest amounts of antibody. What you're going to see here is a trend that shows that the higher the amount of antibodies in convalescent plasma, the lower the death rate in this population that was treated. And that also holds true when you look at the difference between low levels of antibodies and high levels of antibodies when you're comparing this 30 days after treatment. So the hints from this data, the strong hints, are that treating early and treating with plasma that has high levels of antibodies seem to be more effective. Now, the big challenge here is more effective than what? We don't have a control population that didn't get treated that had the same rounds of other types of treatment. Maybe they received specific steroids. Maybe they received some other medication. So we don't have a matched population to say, well, this is compared to people that didn't get convalescent plasma. And that's a huge drawback. That's not the way this study was designed. Again, it's not a randomized clinical trial. So there are certain things we can draw from this, but not others. You also may have seen headlines that said, this treatment reduced deaths by 35%. That's a really challenging way to interpret the data. And that's actually probably drawn from looking at the difference between this death rate and this death rate. This is 35% higher than this rate. But again, that's a small percentage of the population, and that's a 35% relative reduction, and we don't have something to compare it to. So I would be cautious about putting too much stock in this kind of language. What we really want is studies unlike this one, which was observational, non-randomized, and had no controls. We want the highest level of evidence where we can say, how does this compare to a population that was treated equally as much as possible, except for not getting convalescent plasma? That's what we're waiting on. The challenge is that because this has been so successful, it's difficult to recruit patients into a clinical trial where they may get the placebo instead of being in the expanded access program where they know they get convalescent plasma. So this, successful as it has made getting that higher level of data difficult. There are some key questions that still remain in terms of which patients might benefit the most, what's the exact timing to give, what's the level of antibodies that we need to have as our lower threshold, and will there be enough convalescent plasma, because you can only get it from patients that have recovered. At the end of the day, this all comes down to this question. What is the strength of evidence that we need to begin treating people in the midst of a pandemic? Are we comfortable with this level of evidence? Are we going to require randomized clinical trials? There's useful information here, but is this enough to say, yep, this is ready for prime time? Scientists don't believe so. The FDA doesn't believe so. That's why it's an emergency use authorization. More data is needed. All right, that's a deeper dive behind the headlines and all of the headlines that the headlines have created. I hope you find this useful. If you know someone else who might find this useful, please pass that on and share it with them. Thank you for watching Shareable Science Beyond the Blog. I look forward to seeing you for our next episode. Take care.